So, hi everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Um, for today's share session, our themes are value-based approach in adaptation and climate resilience and local authorities' duty of care and legal liability in climate resilience. This presentation is a part of a series brought forward to the Coastal Climate Resilience Collaborative to support knowledge sharing and ideation for regional climate resilience. The project is funded by Natural Resources Canada's Climate Resilient Coastal Communities program, and we're so glad you could join us here today. Yeah, before starting, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining today from Toronto or Toronto, the place in the water where trees are standing, the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Mississaugas of Credit, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee and Wendat. I recognize and respect the traditional stewards of the land and commit to learning from and supporting Indigenous communities in my work and presence here. Thank you. Yeah, I'll let Inas take the next slide.
Thanks, Nikita.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Nikita. I just wanted to take an opportunity to update folks who are on the call today and folks who are catching up and listening to the recording after this conversation that we did manage to get the grant applications in for the FCM implementation for 2 projects. Really, like the second one was just pulled together just in time, but when we were all together in Halifax at LCF last week, you can see Michelle and Heather and I there plucking away at the final details of the grant applications. And we got one in for that was people focused on implementing a network of nature-based climate resilience hubs across different neighborhoods in the Howe Sound. So Town of Gibsons is the lead applicant, and Bowen Island will be benefiting from it, as well as some of the North Shore communities. What happened here? And the second project that most of you had heard about already, but in case it's news to some, there's a collaboration between District of West Vancouver and Squamish Nation to do renaturalizing of 2 sites that were residential properties that District of West Vancouver had purchased to renaturalize into parks and kind of take a nature-based beach nourishment approach for the coastal resilience of that site. And Squamish Nation is going to be supporting with that project as well to take to bring their biodiversity team alongside for implementation of the revegetation of the site that would happen. So keeping fingers crossed, I think we will be hearing about these grant applications in the next couple of weeks with FCM to kind of like go through a series of question answers or re-strengthening of the project as needed or clarifying the application. And then they anticipate to respond within 4 to 6 months. So it will be some time, probably early in the new year. We'll know if we have we have success with these grant applications. And in the meantime, we will be pursuing additional grants for the pieces of these projects, such as the Resilience Hub 1. There was a lot of shaving of the project to kind of fit it into the palatability of FCM, and just to say that we will be pursuing other grant opportunities and obviously more projects. So looking forward to working with the collaborative partners to ideate and bring forward additional projects to benefit all of the communities, the 13 communities in the collaborative. These ones that we've put forward right now will be, benefiting directly 4 or 5 of the collaborative partners, and others will be kind of following along and learning alongside it. So more to come on these conversations, but just wanted to get this update to you all while we were together here today. And I'll pass it back to Nikita to invite our first speaker.
Thanks, Inas. So our first speaker for today is Catherine LeBlanc. Catherine is a professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Moncton in New Brunswick. She has experience in municipal construction and has practiced as a lawyer specializing in construction and regulatory law. Catherine also coordinated NRCan's BRACE project, which focused on training New Brunswick engineers in climate change adaptation. Alongside her teaching, her current research at the university explores climate change adaptation training and environmental responsibilities of professionals. Thanks for joining us here today, Catherine. Over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to hear about all the awesome work that's being done through this project. I know there's all kinds of grant applications going in, but it's great to hear that those are having success and to keep going on with those projects. I'll just open up my screen here. There, so there was an official title in the presentation, and I tried to make it a little more simple for the slides, but it goes along the same lines. So, and it's okay with hearing me? Yeah, perfect. So I'm joining you here from Université de Moncton in New Brunswick on one of our other coasts. And thanks for the invitation to be able to speak about the standard of care and with relation to climates and communities. So an important point. And some of you may be very familiar with some of these points because a lot of the big cases in Canada come from BC and different regions in BC. But for others who are brand new to this, it's just an introduction to the subject. And as was mentioned before, I'm involved with the CRI's IRP program, Infrastructure Professionals Program, uh, on giving more information on these climate law subjects. So great to be here and excited to be able to speak with everyone and to discuss some of these topics afterwards in the other presentations. So here with climate law, the complication is that there's uncertainty everywhere. There's uncertainty on the climate side and uncertainty on the legal side. And when in combination, it kind of puts us in a complicated position as communities. As we're well aware, there's uncertainty, on the climate data, on climate projections to be able to choose, for example, which pathway to go through, you may be very familiar with, and to make decisions for the future in considering all that's available and the data that is available. So that's just on the climate side, which we're familiar with. But then when we look at the legal side, it's the same thing. Things continue to evolve, whether it's with legislation, codes and standards, what hats we're wearing within the community. So we may have professional obligations through our profession or through the different roles that we have within the community, which brings another layer of uncertainty. And as well, we deal with whether it's other partner communities or organizations or not-for-profits, as well as our residents within the communities who have greater expectations and needs that we have to respond to as communities. So within all of that, we have to be able to make decisions as communities and go ahead on these climate questions. And it's not easy, and it may bring about more complications. So this presentation isn't to make anyone worried or, to make those decisions, but how can we make them with having full knowledge of what's out there and to be able to make sure that we're considering all the aspects. So here, the hard part is that we make a decision and it could be questioned whether it's months or years later and through different means as well. So there could be a legislative framework to the decisions we're making, for example, an environmental permits that may be necessary for a project going forward, or regulators, whether it's professional regulators or regulators in certain sectors that we're working in through community projects on these climate questions. As well, there could be administrative reviews of the decisions, and there can be lawsuits as well. So today we're going to speak on the negligence side of things, but as well, there could be other, for example, nuisance cases or charter questions or all of those other questions that could be dealt with in another presentation. So as I said, there could be long delays between the decision that we're making and when that decision is reviewed or consistent. So it could be months or years later. And a good thing is that a lot of these cases settle out of the courts, which means less costs and less time for those that are involved. But it also means that there's less information available to us to look at, what other communities have gone through and how those cases were resolved, because it would be confidential within the parties when it's settled outside of court. So it means, again, like I was speaking about before, more uncertainty in going forward and knowing what we should do in a certain situation when there's those risks or uncertainty that's involved. So with negligence lawsuits, the question that's being looked at is, was the decision to act or not to act reasonable in the circumstances? And so, for example, there could be, flooding or some other climate event. And then whether it's a resident or a property owner, for example, that would have damage to their property, could decide to go back on a decision by a municipality, for example, on their inspection process for the sewer system for the municipality. I'm just giving one example. And then it would have to be looked at whether the decision to inspect or maintain that system was reasonable in the circumstances at the time that the event occurred. So a different things or elements that are looked at for those lawsuits is whether there was a duty of care that was owed to the person that's contesting the decision or the action, which for municipalities, there's a lot of people that rely on those decisions. So that usually isn't the big question, but the big question, especially on climate cases, is what is the standard of care? So what was reasonable in the circumstances? And we'll go through the other points more quickly, but I'm going to come back on the standard of care later in the presentation. So other questions that are looked at is whether the decision, there's a link between the decision and what happened, so what the damages were, and how close, so how foreseeable was it that the decision that was made, for example, to inspect things on a monthly level or yearly level, or not to maintain a system a certain way or others, whether it was foreseeable that that could cause damages. And then again, what are the damages that were caused? What are they complaining that would have happened, whether it's property damage, for example, or someone that was injured through something that happened within the community. And again, in the climate world, things get a little more complicated for those cases. For example, based on what is reasonable, how to evaluate the damages when we're looking at property damages. There's still questions on how those are calculated, and we can get into that later. And another important point for these lawsuits when it's in relation to government communities is the distinction that the courts have made between policy decisions and operational decisions. So policy decisions are those that are made looking at the big picture, at all the factors, whether it's social factors, financial factors, or policy factors. And operational decisions are the day-to-day decisions that are made, most often by the employees that are closest to the public and less or on a different level in the organizational structure of the community. So when it's a policy decision, it's considered or concluded that by looking at all the factors, even if there's one or certain people that are affected negatively, the decision was made for the benefit of everyone, and those decisions should be protected and aren't questioned later through a negligence lawsuit. But if it's an operational decision, the same framework would apply for negligence as any other case, whether it's a city, community, or anyone else who is present in that lawsuit. So different factors to consider on whether it's a policy decision or an operational decision is what was the level of the decision maker. So is it the director or the city manager that's making the decision, or is it the operator of the equipment that's making the decision? If it's someone higher up in the organizational structure, more likely it's a policy decision. And then what kind of process was involved in the decision? Is it a in-the-minute decision that's made, or is it something that took months and months through different committees, through different meetings to be able to make that decision? The more complex the process is, the more likely it's a policy decision. And then again, with the two other factors, if there's budget considerations, then more likely that it's policy. And when there's objective criteria being considered as well on the policy side of things. So a lot of communities in response to all this criteria say we'll just put policy on everything to protect us from these kinds of lawsuits. And the courts went ahead of that and said just because there's a word policy somewhere in that decision doesn't automatically protect that type of decision. It's really looking at all these different factors altogether to decide what type of decision it is. And then, like I said, coming back to what's reasonable, the courts would have to decide whether what the community did or didn't do was reasonable in the circumstances. It's important to consider that that evolves over time. So what we knew 20 years ago about climate and what we should be doing is not the same thing we know today and not the same thing that we're going to know 20 years from now. So just like on the climate side, it changes, the response to what is reasonable in the circumstances will also evolve. The good thing for us to know is that it's not a standard of perfection, so we don't need to be perfect as communities. We just need to do what is reasonable to be protected from those types of lawsuits. So things that are considered is what type of information was known at the time the decision was made, not now, 3 years later when we're in court, but when the decision was made, what was known at that point, what were the circumstances around that event, what was in place at that time, whether it's on in a law or in codes of standards for that specific activity. And it's important to note that even if everything was followed according to the law or according to the codes and standards in place, it doesn't mean that's enough. So that's the minimum. We have to look at what's reasonable. What's reasonable may be more than what's minimum, the minimum activity that's required by the law or the code and standard in place. And also what's looked at is the common practice or industry standards for that type of activity. So here, how do we answer to all of that and try and continue to be able to make decisions, knowing that those decisions can be questioned later? So just some tips that we can look at, these, not all of them, but just a few that we can think about, is to be able to document the decision-making process. So if we're going to question years later what information was available at the time of the decision, it'd be nice to be able to go back and have notes of, how things were decided or what process was used to make that decision. Also to look at what the best practices are in other communities, which you're already doing with this collaborative here, to be able to look at what's going on elsewhere and to be able to adopt those same practices if they function within that community. To promote up-to-date information and practices on climate and those climate questions. Continuously review what's out there, what the practices are, and if they're out of date, we can put pressure and make sure that those are updated, whether it's different standards that are being implemented or otherwise, because the greater difference there is between what's in those codes and standards and what's actually being done creates more uncertainty and more room to decide what's reasonable or not, and harder for the communities to know actually what to do in those circumstances. And as well, monitor trends with legislation, codes, and standards and other frameworks that are out there. For example, in my province in New Brunswick, there's an overhaul of the environmental legislation right now that's going on. So just to be able to know in the projects going forward, once the project is implemented, whatever project it is, for example, in 2 years, well, I know already that in 2 years, it probably won't be the same legislation that's in place. It will have evolved at that time. So just knowing ahead of time that it's coming up, I might want to pay attention to what's going on in that legislative reform to be able to inform my community or the partners that I'm working with on that project. And one key important point in all of this is collaboration to be able to reduce those risks. And that's exactly what you're doing with this group here, because often we get tunnel vision in looking at what our priorities are for the community. And we need to be able to look at more out there, what's going on in other communities, what's going on in other perspectives or other sectors that we could use for the projects that we want to work on. So as we know, it may take more time, more resources at first to collaborate and to look at what else is out there for us, but it saves in time and resources in the long run. So there's potential to find other solutions and decrease risks in the long run if we know what's out there, instead of waiting for those risks to come up to be able to deal with them ahead of time and to be able to consider them in our decision-making process, and to be able to build that network up front instead of trying to reach out for the first time when there's a crisis or whether there's an event. So those are just a couple examples of things that we can do to respond to those risks that we have with the decisions being contested many years or months later through the communities. So it's not a scary or worrisome aspect that I want to give to this presentation today, but just things to be able to think about when we're making those decisions, whether it's on a day-to-day level or through the big projects that we're working on. So that's just, I know I had only a short time for today, but just a little introduction to those topics on today's front. And I'll hand things back over, and I think we'll have time for questions or discussion after all the presentations. So.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I think it's really helpful, and a lot of members here had interest in this topic. I think if you're okay, we can take questions now for this presentation while the content is still fresh. So, yeah, the floor is open for questions. If you have any questions, you can raise your hands or type your questions in the chat.
I can get us going while folks are thinking about their questions. It's such a important topic, Catherine. Thank you so much for your presentation and what you brought up in terms of the value of the collaborative, for them to just, for folks to know what peers in the space are doing, what's, what is the level of care being taken by various municipalities in the same region, for example. That's one that I think that we can continue to root into as in our conversations and as we get together in our kind of periodic meetings within the collaborative. So maybe bringing this topic up every now and then as a standing item to check in on kind of what are the challenges that are coming up. I'm curious in terms of the, the reasonability of it, or like what is the standard of care? You shared some examples. What should be communicated? Like, is there a piece that you can refer to in terms of like, how would municipalities communicate to the public around what they're doing with respect to climate resilience, and so that there's a set of level of expectations set? Is that something that that you've seen examples of, or that you can speak to a bit in terms of communicating the setting of expectation for the public and for the municipality to just have that conversation channel about what are the activities that the municipality is doing related to climate resilience, and what the public might be expecting, and what there might be in terms of gaps that they should take care of themselves as private asset owners.
Exactly. So that will form part of, if ever there was something to happen and it ends up in a lawsuit, what information was communicated and how that communication happened. And also what's the process involved, just to be able to communicate what the process is involved, whether it's to the residents or other communities that we're working with or other partners. So to have that information be transparent would help to be able to go back and look on that, for example, one example is the backflow valves for residences. And, that was my example with sewer systems earlier. But if there's communication out there to tell the residents that they should look into that for their houses and to be able to make those updates, then it would help the municipality later if ever there was someone that contested, why didn't they do more? Well, that's we did what was reasonable in the circumstances. We didn't go to each house and, go and inspect, but we told people that they should go and get some help if they need to. So that could be one thing that could be brought forward. So communication is very, very important. And to come back on the collaboration point with different communities. So it's not a one size fits all, as we know very well, to say every community should respond identically to situations, because we know that's not how things are considered. There's different realities, different contexts. But if we're not even looking at what exists elsewhere and in those other communities, then we're not doing ourselves a favor right now, or if ever that decision would be contested. So very important. And why not make use of the information and, not reinvent the wheel every time we want to go out there and work on these projects. So it's things that we're already doing, but not only does it help in a practical sense today, it would help later if ever someone would be looking at what decisions were made or what wasn't done for a community. Because there's limited budget, limited time, and we can't get to all projects right away for each of the communities. So there's some things that are nice to have, but even deciding or having information on the lists that were decided, for example, the must-haves and nice-to-have for the projects going forward, that would be one example of documenting the process that's involved in making those priorities.
Thank you. I have another question, but I'm going to pause to see if others want to chime in first? Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for joining. I'll ask the other question around the duty of care. So, earlier on in the year, we had a presentation by CSA, the Canadian Standards Association, and Engineers Geoscientists BC to share about, with codes and standards going through their own cycle of consideration of climate change and looking forward. Thanks, Lisa, for your comment as well. And oftentimes municipalities are hiring consultants to do the design and the work to do with implementation of climate resiliency for their infrastructure. Do you have a line of sight to the lawsuits? Like who is being sued? Is it the professionals that are being sued in terms of their duty of care for or potential negligence on consideration of climate change in the design that was implemented? Or is it that the municipalities are at the forefront of that, and the public coming to municipalities with expectation of them having been responsible for taking care of the needs of the municipality? I hope I designed that question well enough for you to be able to speak to, but looking forward to hear kind of like who's at the forefront of lawsuits potentially.
So potentially it can be the communities themselves, as we have seen. And it's not only for negligence cases, that's just an example today, but for example, there have been charter questions on climate considerations in the last few years. So whether there's a right to have, a healthy environment, for example. So those are some of the cases that are going through the system right now. So it can be the communities, it can be the professionals themselves individually, or through the consultant, for example, if it's consultants, so the consultant organizations. And also, it's not necessarily the communities that are on the defending side of things. For example, they could be the ones going after someone else or some other organization or some other level of government for making the decision. So that's kind of the reversal of the case of where it could be communities that are, have been affected by another decision that someone or some other organization has made. So I didn't get into that in the presentation, but it's also something to consider.
Thank you. That's really enlightening.
Thanks, Catherine. If we don't, Chris, I see you are.
Yeah, just a quick, I guess more of a case study question. I'm wondering if you can shed some light on. I'm with the District of West Vancouver, and Lions Bay is right next door. And as you may be aware, there was a landslide in December 2024 that killed 2 residents, sadly. And I'm just very curious because it's sort of been going through the courts, and now the province has denied sort of responsibility for the event, arguing that it was a quote unquote act of God, a natural event. And I'm just really curious, like, how well would that argument hold up in court? It seems to downplay climate change completely. And especially knowing that in 2022, there was actually a report sent to the Lions Bay Council explicitly stating that climate change could very well increase the severity and frequency of these landslides. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that a little bit. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation in general.
So thank you very much for your question. Unfortunately, I can't comment on the individual cases because I'm on the academic side now instead of practicing, but interesting to think about. On one level, it's important to consider that things are changing through the court system as well, in recognition of what's needed and what the minimum levels are for climate. So what the courts were recognizing 20 years ago and all the cases from 20 years ago don't necessarily apply the same way right now, because there's more information available and more information that should be considered in those cases. So I can't comment on that one specifically and what information was available at the time for that one. But it's just that the whole court system is based on looking behind. So the back to the future comment, we're looking behind at older cases to make new decisions every day in the court system. But especially with climate cases, we can't just apply blindly those cases, because things have changed even within the few years from other decisions on what's out there and what is considered to be the standard of care at the time that whatever event happened. So whether it was a landslide or other event. So that's something that complicates even further in those climate cases compared to any other type of negligence case. But again, no comment specifically on that case, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, really appreciate the presentation. Thank you. Moving on to the next theme of our session today, value-based approach for climate resilience. Our next speaker is Thy Huynh, presenting on value-based approach, why we should center community values in our adaptation efforts. T is a research assistant and adaptation consultant with the Living with Water project. She holds a Master's of Environmental Studies from University of Waterloo, where she explored themes of equity and reconciliation in her work. T integrates these learnings into practice, fostering inclusive approaches to climate adaptation and human-to-nature relationships. She is passionate about connecting with people, listening to their stories, and continuing to engage meaningful storytelling and community engagement throughout her career. Over to you, T. Thanks for joining us today. I'll get you to share your screen.
Can everyone see it?
Yeah, all
And
good.
can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you're all good.
Okay, amazing. Thank you, Nikita, for introducing me. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well and is having a good morning or day wherever you are on this beautiful planet. My name is Thy Huynh. I'm a research assistant and adaptation consultant with the Living with Water project. I would like to thank, honor, and acknowledge the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation for their stewardship of the land that I reside on, also known as Oakville, Ontario. Today, I have been given the honor to talk about some research that I've been working on around values-based adaptation. And within my presentation, I want to lay a bit of groundwork of what a values-based approach can look like and how you might begin incorporating it within your adaptation efforts or within the CCRC project more broadly. As a little disclaimer, local governments and communities have been engaging in this work for some time now, whether they call it a values-based approach or not. But perhaps while I'm presenting, you can reflect on some of the processes that you've been a part of and see if there are any overlap or even tensions that arise. So to provide some context on the Living with Water project, it's a multidisciplinary research project that approaches sea level rise as an opportunity to develop new ways of living with water along the south coast of BC. We focus on expanding the solution space for decision makers, planners, and communities by providing new perspectives, resources, and decision support tools to foster collaborative coastal flood adaptation solutions. If you want to learn more about the project and other projects that we've been working on, feel free to visit the livingwithwater.ca website, which I can put in the chat after my presentation. Before I jump into the content, I just want to give a heartfelt shout out to my amazing Living with Water team and colleagues, in particular, Tira, Julia, Kendra, Amelia, and of course, Case and Vanessa, who laid such a strong foundation for this work. And also a big thank you to Christy Ascioni from PICS, who created the beautiful process diagram, as well as designed the final community and policy briefs. So let's start with the basics. What are values and why should we care about them within climate adaptation work? So values can be tangible or intangible. Tangible ones are often easier to measure, things like economic stability, infrastructure, food security, or disaster resilience, whereas intangible values are rooted in lived experiences and can be harder to quantify. Think about things like mental health, sense of community, cultural and spiritual traditions, or even the relationships with your environment. Of course, these aren't always clear-cut categories. There are a lot of values that span both tangible and intangible groups. For example, food security is considered a tangible value. However, access to cultural and local food sources begins to blend into cultural practices, which is deemed intangible. Conventional climate adaptation often prioritizes these tangible values while overlooking the intangible that shape how communities experience and respond to climate change. Without considering this range of values, adaptation strategies risk being ineffective, socially dividing, or even harmful to those they intend to support, which leads me to the reasons on why we should be foregrounding values within adaptation efforts. Values shape how people see and respond to climate risks. If a flood threatens your home, your ancestral land, or a culturally important species, you're going to view that threat very differently than if those values weren't at stake. And when it comes time to act, what you value will guide your decisions, such as deciding to protect crops and livestock before deciding which evacuation routes to go on. These are deeply personal decisions, and they're not something outsiders like researchers or policymakers can assume or define. Only the communities themselves can say what matters most and how to respond. So what does a values-based approach look like, and what can it look like in practice? Well, a values-based approach is about bringing community priorities, strengths, and needs into the same space as technical and economic considerations. When adapting to changing climates, it's important that community values are considered throughout each phase of the process. Too often, climate strategies fail because they don't reflect the lived realities of those we aim to support. So a VBA is about co-creating solutions that are meaningful, effective, and deeply grounded in place. This is just a high-level overview of some of the process objectives of this framework. Just considering time, I won't go into them, but I just wanted to highlight in particular recognizing that values are inherently political and linked to power dynamics. So when you are engaging in this work, recognizing whose values are actually being amplified and foregrounded, and what are the potential power dynamics that are underlying that decision. And with that, this is the VBA process framework that my team and I have developed. At the center is trust, and holding all of the smaller pieces together is building relationships, and each of the arrows represents each phase of the process. One design feature that I wanted to shed light on was the fact that there's no definitive start and end point of the process, which kind of insinuates this iterative process and meeting communities and practitioners where they're at and developing and co-developing a pathway forward that works for all parties involved. So with that, let's jump into each of the phases of the process. The first one, as I mentioned is building trust and relationships. Before planning or discussing values, we start by building trust. This means showing up consistently, listening with care, and being honest about what's possible. Trust is the foundation of everything. As the BC Community Forestry Association put it, building social license or relationships starts with transparency and recognizing that success looks different in every context. They also emphasize the importance of place-based relationships and avoiding this one-size-fits-all manner to building trust. Next up, we begin centering community and place-based knowledge. Local communities hold deep and often intergenerational knowledge. It's not just about acknowledging that this knowledge exists, but it's about truly centering and amplifying it. This is especially important when working with Indigenous leaders and communities. Foregrounding and amplifying such knowledge systems allows for adaptation efforts to be connected and embedded in the lived experiences of those most impacted. An example of this is through an academic study with the Swinomish tribal community in what is known as Washington, D.C. With the help of a community advisory board, the research team and community were able to create these Indigenous health indicators that captured the intangible aspects of health that the community prioritized, demonstrating a way to weave knowledge systems and center them rather than adding them as an accessory resource. A metaphor I like to use is we want knowledge systems to be ingredients within a cake rather than just the icing on top. Once we begin to uncover and center these community knowledge systems and place-based knowledge, we begin to uncover the values that are at play. So people experience climate impacts very differently depending on their relationship to place. The process of surfacing values must be inclusive, respectful, and tailored to each community. The City of Surrey's CFAS, or Coastal Flood Adaptation Strategy, their engagement work is a great example of how to host prioritization workshops, where they emphasize the need for a two-way dialogue, mutual respect, and balance. Balance is especially key when navigating diverse perspectives, as it encourages all voices to be heard and considered throughout the process. Once we begin to acknowledge and uncover the values that are at play, we can transition into co-developing shared values. And I want to make clear that this step isn't about forcing agreement. It's about identifying common ground or fostering mutual respect across differing or even conflicting values. Adaptation efforts are stronger when multiple perspectives are acknowledged and incorporated. So the goal is to co-create a foundation that reflects collective priorities and lived experiences. A study done with the Gitagot Nation by Reed et al. In 2014 demonstrates one way of uncovering community values and how these can inform and be woven into adaptation planning. The methodology used within this report was pivotal to the work of this framework, so I highly recommend checking out this article. Moving along is evaluating adaptation options. So once you know what matters to a community, you can begin evaluating options in a much more holistic way. You may begin asking questions like, are the proposed solutions not just technically sound, but aligned with community priorities? By placing values at the core of decision-making, communities can select adaptation solutions that are uniquely tailored and aligned with their priorities, strengths, needs, and contribute to long-term resilience. One example is a PEI case study, which uses GIS mapping to capture social and cultural values to inform conservation decision-making. And by using a participatory mapping approach, the communities were able to map place-based values, showing why certain areas are important to the communities and should be prioritized for adaptation and protection. Moreover, this participatory mapping process helped to build trust and strengthen the project governance overall. Once we begin to evaluate the different adaptation options that are favored and prioritized, we can move into meaningful action and implementation. It's easy for values to get lost between the planning and action phases, but when implementation is grounded in what people care about, strategies can gain more traction and legitimacy. It helps bridge the gap between planning and meaningful on-the-ground action. The Biocultural Indicator Manual from the First Nations Fisheries Legacy Fund and the Center for Indigenous Fisheries offers a useful framework here. Similar to the previous example with Swinomish Tribal Council, the Biocultural Indicator Manual aims to bring together Indigenous knowledge and Western science to better manage fish and freshwater resources. This approach ensures that community values are guiding freshwater management, decision-making processes, and support long-term stewardship of water and fish populations, re-emphasizing the difference between solely just integrating Indigenous knowledge systems, but centering and foregrounding it within the project itself. And last but not least is the monitoring and measuring progress phase. Adaptation, as you all know, is not a one-time fix. It's a continuous process of learning, reflecting, and revising. When monitoring and evaluation metrics are centered on community values, they help ensure that progress is measured by what truly matters to those affected, not just by technical outcomes. This stage requires creativity, accountability, and long-term commitment to community well-being. The Sea to City project in the city of Vancouver is a strong example of how to track success in a values-aligned way. By integrating community values and scenario-based outcomes, the project provides a comprehensive approach to tracking success and guiding priority adaptation actions, translating community values into a set of indicators or criteria that can be measured. Altogether, these steps support a values-based approach that is community-driven, inclusive, and grounded in the realities of place. They remind us that adaptation isn't just about infrastructure or technology, but it's about the relationships, priorities, and the kind of future communities want to shape. Of course, this work isn't always easy and comes with its own complexities and challenges. First being that communities tend to hold diverse values, and balancing them takes care. Sometimes consensus is needed, other times it's more meaningful to let multiple perspectives coexist. So understanding when each of those outcomes are favored is important. Second, cultural sensitivity is also essential. We must move away from extractive practices, especially cherry-picking Indigenous knowledge systems, and instead support communities to lead and decide how their knowledge is being used. This takes time, trust, and commitment, but it's worth it. When values are centered, adaptation becomes more equitable, durable, and grounded. So to conclude, a values-based approach is about deepening the impact adaptation efforts can have. It puts lived experiences, Indigenous and local knowledge, and community expertise at the center of climate work. At the end of the day, adopting this approach isn't just about responding to change and navigating different priorities. It's about implementing place-based, socially accepted, and effective adaptation solutions that resonate with communities and empower local strengths and knowledge. As I mentioned, we released a community brief and policy brief on this framework. And again, I can put the links in the chat for folks. But that concludes my presentation. And I guess I'll pass it on to Kat.
Thanks, T. I've put the links to the research in the chat.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much, Nikita.
Thank you for the great presentation. And our next presenter on the same theme is Kathryn Wells. Just a second, I think I lost my screen here. Yes. Yeah, Catherine will be presenting on building climate resilience in rural and remote communities. Kat is a project manager at the Serving Rural and Remote Communities, co-developing place-based climate resilience solutions with the Pacific Institute of Climate Solutions, also known as PICS, at Simon Fraser University. The research project aims to weave place-based and Indigenous knowledges with academic research to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and climate vulnerabilities. By engaging in community-based research, CAT maintains focus on addressing current social, cultural, and environmental challenges for those who are most marginalized. She is also committed to advancing accessible knowledge, sharing, caring for people and the environment, and minimizing social inequalities throughout their work and life. Over to you, Kat. Thanks for joining us today. I will get you to share your screen now.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I will jump right in. So yeah, building climate resilience in rural and remote communities. We've kind of nicknamed the super long project name to Rural Community Resilience Project. I'm Kathryn Wells. I usually go by Kat. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns, and I'm the research project manager, as mentioned. I live here on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, which includes Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt people. But I grew up on Treaty 7 territory, which is the Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda, and Blackfoot Nations land. I also just wanted to quickly mention that Nancy Allweiler, the principal investigator of the project, sends her regrets for not being able to join today, but we're excited to share our project with everybody. So I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that climate impacts disproportionately impact rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. Our well-being and survival depends on increasing climate resilience that comes from the connection, the wisdom, and the values that Indigenous peoples have to the land, water, and ecosystems. Our commitment is to work with communities to help address the imbalances our colonial practices have produced. So thank you so much for having me here today. Jumping right into the project. So we're funded by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, PICS. We have university researchers at SFU, UVic, University of Calgary, and University of Waterloo, as well as research partners at First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Council, which is nicknamed FINIC, at BC Housing, as well as at Technical Safety BC. And our project goal is really to work together to enable and empower rural, remote, and Indigenous communities to engage with climate resilient housing, technical systems, and energy security across BC. So through augmenting and informing existing strategies, policies, regulations, legislation, we aim to build relationships and resources that reflect our values for low carbon resilience within our scope. And by developing these relationships and working with community members that are already knowledgeable in the field, we want to help bolster their capacity with ours. And additionally, we aim to produce usable and accessible outputs for communities to embed climate resilience really into their housing and infrastructure. So things like retrofitting and as well as new builds. So, getting into the values-based approach, I'm gonna kind of tell you the story of what's happened so far. So initially the project, we wanted to connect with rural, remote communities to co-develop climate resilient housing solutions by partnering with 3 to 4 communities and using that as sort of the case study that we would move forward with the project. But we faced some challenges with that. So initial consultation with some communities identified that these communities face a lot of demands on their time and their expertise and are really seeking relationships where the research team brings tangible things or products that add value to their work. They welcomed the type of work that we were proposing, but really wanted to see the work that we were bringing more developed before signing on. We also found that communities don't want short-lived partnerships that produce, quote unquote, another report on the shelf. The project really needs to have usefulness, is what we kind of concluded. Folks want long-term relationships that produce helpful outputs for communities to have agency in their own decision-making. And so this meant that communities didn't have the capacity for in-depth partnership without established groundwork from our project team. So the groundwork that we did was establishing shared values, which is our values-based approach, through workshops with Charlene Sanjenko that produced this beautiful graphic, which I've sort of nicknamed the values wheel. We also ensured that the whole team had access to training, including OCAP, which is ownership, control, access, and possession, those principles, which I highly recommend if you have the means to do that course. And this was in an attempt to flip the traditional approach on its head. So looking at bottom-up, community feedback driven, leading to a values-based approach. So an example of this is when we bring the whole team together, we've implemented grounding exercises that remind us of the values that we came together around in the first year of the project. So I'm going to invite you to take a moment, maybe shift around in your seat a little bit, put your feet on the ground. You can close your eyes or keep them open and really just, I guess, start paying attention to where your feet are, where you're touching the chair maybe, how you're feeling today, how you're coming into this presentation. And I encourage you to think of a word of kind of where you're landing today. What are you bringing to the workshop? How are you feeling? You can keep that to yourself. But now I'd like you to kind of bring your attention to the screen. And when you look at this wheel, what's the first thing that kind of pops out for you? Where did your eyes glance first? And let me know if you can't see any of the smaller text. I can kind of go over it. And when you're noticing what you kind of were drawn to or what popped out for you first, I want you to try and figure out why you think that's where you were drawn. And I encourage you to put your answer in the chat. Or please feel welcome to unmute and let me know. So, what's the first thing that popped out? And why do you think that's what you were drawn to? I'll go first. So for me, looking at it, the word no really pops out for me. And I think it's because often when we're doing this exercise, I'm not the one talking. So I kind of feel like maybe I'm the one that needs to be knowledgeable here because I'm presenting. Embody, thank you. Be, yeah.
It's cliche to say that collaborative popped out for me.
given the theme of our group, maybe.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great feeling to have with the group. Awesome. Thank you for participating in the chat. Right in the center. Yeah, that's good. Cool. Well, thanks for indulging me in that little exercise. I'm going to move on to sort of the outward facing piece now. And so this is sort of the principles that we've come up with in terms of connecting with community partners. So transparency, our values are sort of to have an earnest and developed introduction to community values, project goals, and capacity. Come properly prepared with knowledge and respect for the communities and with defined parameters of contributions. So engagement can differ by and is defined by community. Respecting voices of elders, knowledge keepers, and youth is priority. And being well prepared, including with the OCAP principles, the 4 Rs, which are respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility, as well as knowledge of culturally safe engagement practices and trauma-informed practices. And then holding space is like when we're co-learning and doing co-development, it requires listening and unlearning, paying attention to ways of knowing and systems of governance, traditional laws and goals of community partners. And then adaptability. This is always a challenge with these types of projects. So timelines and paths, they're going to change, but the project content or goals, so they might need to be adapted. So we all have to be flexible based on capacity and needs. And just a note that co-produced research is rooted in decolonial methodology and often follows what many researchers consider a non-linear path. So an example of one of the initiatives that we sort of have with the project is the Fire Resilience Handbook that we're creating. Communities, when we spoke to them, told us that there were high-level reports and guides that applied broadly, but were less helpful to rural and remote communities, and so they saw a need for a more targeted workbook or a handbook that would be customized for each community. So one of these research initiatives we took on was developing this community fire resilience handbook, which augments the resources like FireSmart. And then we held a series of workshops with First Nations housing and emergency management people for feedback. And so each workshop sort of built upon the last to integrate the feedback and demonstrate it through sort of the next presentation or workshop. And these are ongoing for us. So the next one we're holding in early November it's going to be hosted through FINIC. So if you're interested, let me know. I can forward you the invitation through them. And so we really wanted it to be tailored to rural communities and customizable to fit their unique needs, which kind of fits into the usefulness piece. And that's where this wheel kind of comes into play. We want to provide like a blank one for people to fill out, but then we also have this one that gives an example of different ways you can fill it out, different things that you might add into it. So including these fillable worksheets for communities to develop their own values and their priorities, as well as planning for wildfire preparation. So the key learning here was that just our focus had to change shift, I guess, from a case study approach to the broader scope. So hosting workshops for targeted community feedback and having open dialogue about the development of the actual resources that we're coming up with. And then I just wanted to mention some other research initiatives. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but the values-based risk assessment and management is Inez's work that developed a risk assessment and management framework, starting with community values. And then the framework was applied working with the town of Gibsons and their community data, and was presented to the Gibson staff, town of Gibson staff. And for her thesis, it was defended on October 14th and she passed. So send a big congratulations to Inez, because that's a huge thing. So congrats. So that's one of the initiatives we've got. Yeah, big claps and big party. Congrats. So another initiative we've got is the building materials. So we're doing a deep dive into sort of the analysis of climate resilient building materials, including their costs and accessibility for rural and remote communities. So we're developing quick reference fact sheets as well as a guidebook for folks interested in learning more about alternative options for building construction materials that are resilient to climate hazards such as floods, wildfires, extreme weather, etc. And looking forward, we're researching climate resilient materials and techniques for retrofits as well. And then the third one on here is solar photovoltaic podcast series for northern communities, which is in the works right now. So stay tuned for the launch of our podcast we're combining technical knowledge with community stories that really demonstrate climate resilience in action, because there's a lot of really interesting and cool initiatives going on already. So I'm excited about that. And then the newest initiative is looking at skilled labor needs for rural and remote communities in northern BC, which kind of ties a lot of these initiatives together. We're also looking at sort of how the multiplying costs based on distance for the nearest resource center. So like the nearest city or town that is big enough to kind of have a Tim Hortons, for example. Yeah, so we're working on that now. We've got a really cool interactive map that some of our research assistants are developing. And so, yeah, I just wanted to kind of do a little quick overview, and then we can segue into questions or discussion. But the values-based approach is bottom-up, community feedback driven, relationship focused, practical, that produce products to promote community agency. And then the question that always comes up, or I guess we sort of ensure is coming up, is something that I'm going to pose to the group. So what or who might be missing from this? Based on your knowledge and your, I guess, participation in this project, what could be missing or who is missing? Feel welcome to put in the chat or unmute. Is there anyone missing? There's no way we are totally inclusive based on our project and parameters, of course. Yeah. Children, youth, voice for animals and plants. Yeah, that's a good one. How does that integrate into housing and yeah, research goals? Future generations. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I'd like to open that up into discussion now, and we can go a little bit further if you want. I'm just going to quickly put my email up on the screen and just say thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to chatting more. Perfect. I'm just going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Kat. Feel free to lead the discussions, and we're open for questions. You can raise your hands or put your questions in the chat. We're getting some good feedback in the chat.
Great presentation by both of you. Thank you so much, Kath and T, for sharing your research and knowledge and the work. I know this is long-term work, long-term research, and very multi-partner initiatives that you're bringing to the collaborative. So I really appreciate your time and your sharing here.
Thank you for having us, Inez and Nikita.
No worries.
It's a great project.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And I think we would also really love the cool resources that will be coming up, Kat, the podcast series and the handbook. So whenever that's available, just let us know.
Yeah, our website is launching hopefully in the next month or two, so I will definitely keep you posted.
Yeah, we'll share that along for sure. Looking forward to it. And T, we did put the website for the Living with Water project in there, and yeah, great to have Case's involvement through the advisory group. So I think we'll bring in more of the research to the group as time goes. And you know, one of the I'll just kind of open up with some thoughts before leading into questions is that one of the reasons we're excited to have you present to the group is because these research initiatives that are funded by PICS are very much meant to be, you know, partnered and implementable research. So looking for this work to come to life through the real life examples and projects that we're looking to progress within the collaborative. For example, the 2 applications we've just put in, as we move to implementation, how can we bring, you know, the applications themselves. I think the ideation had a value-based approach to begin with, just by the group that was coming together to kind of ideate that and put it forward. But we didn't quite label it that, as T mentioned. You know, a lot of times we're doing the work without necessarily naming it that way. And so I'm reflecting on that, and kind of the pillars of what the collaborative has come forward together is to work on biodiversity of health as we progress implementation in the communities for climate resiliency, and you know, reconciliation being integrated in every aspect of the project. And you know, for me, that one really links to Kat's question of who's missing at the table. Like, we all hold intent of bringing that forward, that Indigenous knowledge, and the close collaboration between the municipalities and the First Nation partners that are invited into the collaborative. And capacity challenges and competing priorities continues to be an issue, and getting everybody together at the table at the right time, and what's the pace and the process for that is something that we're continuously reflecting on. So yeah, I feel like this work is very relevant, and we'll be weaving it through as you already know. I'm looking forward to more of that. I have one specific question that has come up for me related to T's presentation. You know, you so eloquently put forward the consideration of how to bring forward Indigenous knowledge and natural law, potentially, like, as the values within a project, and you know, letting the community decide where and how their knowledge is used. And then your comment around kind of the diversity of values that can exist when you get into that conversation. I look forward to deep diving into the case studies that you've shared, and kind of like looking at that for shared learning. But I'm wondering if you have any further thoughts on that to kind of share around practices. What would be the engagement practice or the methods to use to do that in a good way, to kind of like take the steps towards looking at the various value systems that can come forward in a project?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the billion-dollar question of that's a lifelong journey to explore, because every community will be different with their engagement process. And it's also important to recognize the engagement fatigue that communities might be facing as well. So just because they aren't able to necessarily participate as in-depthly or as actively as you may hope, that doesn't mean that you're not still engaging in meaningful work. You're just respecting the boundaries that they may place. So I think I don't have a cut answer to that question, but I think it is just about having these conversations transparently and being able to foster those relationships and trust in making the communities comfortable with being able to set those boundaries and being able to share their knowledge and being able to decide and decipher how they want their knowledge to be used in a certain way. So that would be my answer.
Thanks, Dee. The floor is open for questions in the chat, or you can raise your hands.
I can't find the raise hand button, but I'll chime in, which is not really a clearly formulated question, just kind of a thought I'm carrying, which is some recent engagement we did through another ICLEI project with some businesses in our floodplain to try and understand their experiences and concerns to feed into a project. And it was my first time trying to engage with that particular sector, and it was an interest. Usually, I think we're more trying to engage with residents and community. So it was an interesting, different challenge. So I don't know if you have any kind of wisdom to share, or maybe just commiserate, because I think this is the ongoing challenge that they have so many pressures on them, and for them, climate was not up because we haven't experienced significant flooding yet. So it wasn't a high priority concern for them. So even just getting them to come to have a conversation with us when they're dealing with presumably tariffs and just all the business pressures that they're under currently. And I think we see that a bit in climate too, with community, where, you know, the housing crisis and so many other crises are competing for attention, sadly. So yeah, I assume that came up in your work, and I don't know if there's something that you want to say about kind of how we do this work and respecting people's capacity, but needing to hear or kind of learn from their experiences and their on the ground understanding of the place. That's a tension I just feel constantly. I don't want to burden people, but I also know that their knowledge is really important to informing the work. So I assume that's something everyone in the room has had some experience with. So I don't know if there's something just we can commiserate for a moment or.
No, I mean, that's a great question, and I think a very impactful place to be, where you're on one hand trying to adopt or basically appreciate the boundaries that communities are facing and meeting them where they're at, but also acknowledging the intersectionality of everything and wanting to advance their climate resilience strategies or their flood management strategies. I think from my perspective and knowledge and work within this field would be being upfront about where you're coming from. Being like, I recognize that climate may not be a top priority for you right now, but from my knowledge and from the resources that we have access to, flooding is something that you should be considering and should start to take into account, whether that's through the co-benefits of adapting to climate change and their business, whether that's being able to just have information sessions with the community and creating that foundation of like, this is what climate change is. This is why you need to start thinking about it. But I also think it's an opportunity to also be creative and getting Indigenous or community knowledge systems on what their current knowledge foundation and baseline is. So this could be through community mapping, or this could be through community collages, and just having these open-ended prompts that are like, what do you value most right now? Is that what is a key concern for your business considering climate change? Or like different open-ended questions like that can help and be rich information that they don't necessarily see as being connected to climate change or helping increase their resilience, but it actually is. And I think just like being able to think of things from different angles is definitely a tricky practice, but I think can be really useful in these times when people don't necessarily claim or consider climate as a top priority right now, but are concerned about something else that will be impacted by climate change inevitably. So I think that's my long-winded question answer. I don't know if Kat, you have any other thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, just sort of reiterating a couple of things that you already said, T. Just coming prepared and kind of meeting people where they're at. I think a challenge that we've faced with our project is that our team is fully remote. So like having a regional project is a little bit different in this way because like you can just kind of show up on site. And we have challenges with that because it's provincial wide and our team is spread all over the place. But yeah, just kind of coming prepared, understanding that there will need to be conversations that change or are different than like what you showed up to talk about necessarily. Um, and yeah, I don't know if I have any good advice, but yeah, I think just that adaptability piece is really important and being able to start these conversations with people might not want to have the conversation at all.
That's great. Thank you both. I appreciate it.
Lisa, I'm gonna add that to our parking lot of items that, we can maybe have a discussion about it, because I wonder if, District of West Van or other communities in the collaborative are also engaging with businesses, and what that is like with all of these competing crises, as you mentioned. There might be some conversation around multi-solving to have, like where is it that we can bring value to them by taking the worry off about climate resilience, because the municipality is thinking about it and trying to support them with that, perhaps.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting conversation. We had a challenge even getting businesses to respond, to even spark the conversation about what would be
Right.
useful to them, or kind of what is the least inconvenient way to engage with them? How do we meet them where they're at? Even just understanding what that looks like for them. It was just much more challenging than I thought, but then also tariffs. I just assumed that upended their world, so understandable.
Chris has a question. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much, T and Kat, for sharing your very insightful and important research. I really appreciated those presentations. So my question is really about this idea of community feedback and co-developing shared values. Um, Many times there are some voices that are the loudest and take up the most space in community. And I guess I'm just wondering, through your research or just your own ideas, um, have you found any strategies to really capture those other voices? Is it really the need to, redouble effort on the engagement? And yeah, I'm just curious about that, if you have any strategies or tips. Thank you.
Kat, maybe I let you start us off.
Sure, yeah. So one of the things that we've kind of prioritized since having to shift from sort of a case study approach, partnering with communities themselves, is making sure that the workshops which are attended by various people that sort of are related mostly to housing and technical systems or infrastructure. Just making sure those are accessible. We're targeting people that are already interested and or working in roles that are related to that. So I think we've had a unique I guess, perspective on that because people are already pretty engaged. But an example of ways that we make these things accessible is making sure that not only we're saying it out loud, showing it visually, we're also providing opportunity to provide feedback in a really easy and accessible way after. We've used Padlet quite a lot to sort of just gain feedback. We'll send reminders out about it. But just looking at accessibility to remove barriers is sort of the place we started, and I think it's going well. But again, we don't know because, as you say, we're only hearing what we're hearing from the people that are willing to provide feedback. So I'm hoping that for things like the Fire Resilience Handbook, that will be sort of a thing that people can distribute in their communities. It has workbooks. I'm hoping that will provide a little bit extra sort of accessibility. There's things that will engage children in the handbook. There's coloring book pages, and like family evacuation route planning activities, so that we're hoping that like families will actually get involved. So I'll keep you posted on that. But that's sort of where our efforts have started. And we're hoping that it will actually pan out in the engagement process. Do you have anything to add, T?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I mainly wanted you to go first because you have you have more experience in the applicability of these values-based work, whereas my work is very theoretical and academically grounded. But with that, I think there are two things to kind of sit with. One being sitting with the humility that you might not be able to engage with everyone that you want to due to current circumstances. I know community timelines are very nonlinear and sporadic, and you can't always expect to be as adaptable as you want to. So I think that's one element. But the second element is in the way that you facilitate these conversations, to ensure that everyone is being heard and there isn't just one voice being overbearing or overpowering the rest of the voices, is try to have small group discussions if you're hosting a workshop. I think that's a more approachable way that people feel more comfortable sharing their input rather than having a large group discussion. I also know through previous workshops that sometimes it just takes one person from the research team just to go around and check in with everyone, being like, how are you doing? Like how has your day been? How has your week been? Kind of getting that context on how they're coming into this conversation can go a really long way in making sure that they can open up a little bit to you and start sharing their ideas. Because I mean, as a young researcher myself, it can be very daunting. And I'd be like, oh, I don't need to share my knowledge. Like everyone else's input is way more valuable than what I have to bring to the conversation. But when you do that one-on-one discussion that's a little bit more intimate, then you start to bolster their confidence. So I think just if you're facilitating a number of people, being able to have just those one-on-one check-ins is, I think, really powerful way that people don't always consider when facilitating workshops because you have a million things to think about. But if you're able to have someone from the research team kind of just do those one-on-one check-ins, I think that's really meaningful and can garner a lot of knowledge that you might not have gotten if you just stuck with a large group discussion or even just small group discussions.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the tips. I wrote them all down and I'll be trying to apply them. So thank you.
Thanks, T. Thanks, Kat. I think we can, this was great discussion, both of you. And we will also be sending an email after this conversation, and we'll put all the links in that email for you to look after. And we have another knowledge share coming up in November. I'll get Inas to share that screen.
Yeah, sure. I'll just, before we go into kind of future knowledge share, I want to add one more couple of notes to Chris's question. I think the approach that T is referring to in terms of checking in personally with folks, it is so important, and it's actually documented and rooted in cultivating a safe space for people to feel connected and comfortable to share. It goes a long way, because those loud voices, have something else that's kind of inviting them to share. And I shared a couple of links in the chat about how Tana Gibson's had a partnership with SFU Center for Dialogue and an entity called Renovate Public Hearings to very intentionally change from the concept of public hearings being this one-way space of feedback from public to the council or to the town staff, to creating a residence assembly that is representative of the demographic of the population that lives within the town, and deliberated in a democratic way in conversation in advance of their official community plan. So instead of only doing engagement after the OCP update was being drafted, they had 30 hours of engagement in small groups, like T was suggesting, and Kat was mentioning, to engage with the community representatives, and then bring it to general public engagement. That was also part of the getting input from everybody. And around the topic of the cultivating safe space, there is an entity that's Indigenous led. There's an organization called Naxmist that's doing great work in this space. So I put the link to their group in the chat as well, in case it's useful to anybody. Like, they do consulting work and kind of do workshops and so on as well. So I think that we're just kind of going through that transition of like, what does a public hearing look like, and what does engagement look like? And yeah, good to draw on case studies and examples that exist. So thanks for bringing that forward, Chris. Sure, Nikita, I'll share my screen, and yeah, maybe as you mentioned, we will also share these in the
Chat.
Yeah, the chat. And next.
Yeah, we have our next knowledge share in November by Stacy and Michelle from Hey Neighbor Collective and Resilient Neighborhoods Connect and Prepare. And I think this will be related to our Community Resilience Hub measures. Along with that, we have a few ICLEI webinars coming up. They're not directly related to this collaborative, but they might be useful in other work that you're doing. I am putting the links in the chat. And Lisa, your question was great about connecting with businesses. So our next ICLEI Peer Network meeting is happening on November 26th, where more municipal practitioners come together, and it is facilitated by our directors, Eva, Megan, and Karina. And there is an exchange of insights, any challenges they've come together in their works, and there's great discussions, and I think there's a lot to take from those conversations. So if you are interested, that is something you can look into. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you joining us here.